Thanks everyone for joining. What I think a good place to start this conversation is taking a look at these two very interesting statistics. As of March 2021, there are more than 550 wearable studies underway. That is, studies that are using wearable and sensor devices as part of the endpoints that are primary or secondary endpoints. And Kaiser Associates says that by 2025, 70% of clinical trials will incorporate some type of wearable sensor. That's pretty tremendous, considering the fact that when you think about 5 years ago, probably close to less than 5% of clinical trials, less than 3% of clinical trials were doing the same. So, we're clearly at a time of, I would think, whoever is on. So just again, a housekeeping note for those of you who are listening in, do keep yourselves on mute. Thanks. So anyway, I think it is definitely a time of transformation for clinical trials. And with that said, why don't we actually launch, Daniel, the very first poll question, just to get a temperature of everyone who is here. Great. So if you could, what's your experience in your company using sensor-derived PROs and devices in clinical trials? In the planning stage, some early experience, just a few trials under your belts, or it's really now an established part of what is happening in your organization regarding clinical trials? Just give a couple of seconds for that. So here we go. Okay. So looks like 60% of you, most of you are early experience with a few trials. There's only a couple, 29% that are in that sort of early planning stage and haven't done it yet. And then, not surprisingly, maybe, just a handful that have really turned this into a organized part of what you're doing in your organization. So let me kind of turn this around. Thanks for sharing that. And let me ask Jinsy to start with. Jinsy, so surprising? What do you think? How does that relate to what is going on in your organization?
No, I really relate, especially in the aspects of early trials, implementations, few trials, just to get, I guess, the experience under board before you can actually implement. So I was very surprised actually to see the number of places actually have an established program. I know at Novartis we have, a digital group, and but actually implementing those with data privacy aspects and everything like that, it's very nice to see that the shift and change in that aspect. So
absolutely. Arnab, what do you think of these results, and what do you think is really sort of driving, from your experience, driving companies forward to start experimenting and start doing these early investments into using devices in clinical trials?
Thank you for the question, Todd, and thank you, Jinsy, for weighing in there. This is actually very interesting, right, to see the amount of energy within the industry around the digital angle, right, and really engaging patients through digital sensors and the whole conversation that's going along, the passive data collection pieces, right? And I do recognize the point that, Jinsy, you made around the data privacy and the security aspects of it. Those have always, before COVID, dominated the conversations, right? The ideas would come up, hey, can we use the Apple Watch for measuring A, B, and C? And then the conversations would go along the lines of, do we have the right data privacy standards in place, right? Now what we are seeing across the industry, across the top 10 pharma, essentially, is the need to be able to do this was primarily catalyzed by COVID, right? The new ways of thinking, the new SOPs around the data privacy processes are also getting established. A lot of that is also driven by, a little bit of clarity in the regulatory landscape as well, right? It's not, I wouldn't go as far as to say the problem has been solved, but there's definitely heading in the right direction. So what we see in consortia like DIME publishing their crowdsourced database of digital endpoints, and the sheer number of companies who are actually contributing to that, right? We are seeing the endpoints actually moving up from exploratory to secondary to primary. I wouldn't be very surprised to see a label claim come in the very near future, right? Given the so many studies that are in the pipeline using these digital measurement methods. So very excited, and to see the trends being echoed here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Adriano, you're involved right now in a clinical study that's using sensor endpoints, sensor devices as part of the endpoints. And what would you say is really the value that is being garnered from doing these kinds of studies? What is it that we're being able to really to understand and collect from these that really were not available before?
I'm trying. Okay, here we go.
There you are.
So, from the last 3 years of client engagements in the pharma space, the one thing I retained vividly is that there's a roadmap, there's an evolution in terms of the simplicity of the types of trials that take place over the course of 2-3 years, right? You start with simpler trials where you deploy some of digital health innovation, some PROs, and then you get that level of confidence that helps you evolve to other things like labeled solutions, software as a medical device. So there's a roadmap to it, right? And one aspect that Arnab and Jinsi brought up is the data privacy is a key gating factor for the industry to have the confidence to dip their toes in the water, and that's a big non-starter conversation if the requirements for running all the health data, PII and PHI, HIPAA compliance, high trust certification, ISO compliance. If you don't have a compliant platform to ingest that data, to hold that data, to manage that data, to report on that data, it's a no-go. So if you don't have anything in-house and you decide to go at it from scratch, you're probably putting yourself into a 2-year, 3-year journey just to get a platform certified, including development, certification, audit trails, and whatnot. But what I'm seeing from our partners and from the industry in general is that the partnership route is where these platforms are licensed and utilized in the context of clinical trials. It's pretty much a trend that helps accelerate the implementation of PRO or wearable devices or connected sensors in the context of a clinical trial. So all this considered, there's a roadmap that will increase in complexity, and that's the trail that most companies are taking right now.
That's really interesting. I mean, and it is one of the kind of the questions that I have, perhaps for everyone in the audience, but I'll start with Jinsi, which is really, to what extent, has pharma really sort of embraced this and has started to create systems and processes to really allow these data, these devices, it's the devices, but it's also really the data that's coming off of these devices to be sort of part of an ecosystem, a research ecosystem.
Yeah, so at Novartis, we have a digital strategy council, actually. And so, any new ideas go to that council, and that council is made up of various different groups like legal, regulatory, compliance, data privacy, IT security. So there's a huge amount of people in that council to ensure, because everything that we do is for patients, right? But we want to make sure that we're protecting that patient's rights and their information. And so whatever we bring to that council, new innovative ideas, they want to ensure we're protecting those patients, because they're obviously trusting us for them to be involved in a clinical trial in the first place, right? And so we have to do our utmost best to make sure that their privacy is kept, confidential, and, every regulation is followed in that aspect, right? So we have all those key players in our council to ensure these securities are placed, firewalls are in place. We have, different group that just decides if it's a medical device versus just a sensor wearable that you're collecting, patient reported outcomes from. So there's different layers, at least in Novartis, that ensures and that we have to go through to make these things available for patients in a clinical trial setting.
No, that's really interesting. Arnab, I mean, have that in your experience? I mean, where are companies in terms of their evolution towards really embracing this as sort of part of sort of the culture of clinical trials?
Yeah, that's a great question, Todd. So what we are seeing out there in the industry is, I mean, I completely agree with what Jinsi just said, right? I think we're seeing a process like that in many of the big pharma companies, right? In terms of going from very fragmented study team led device selection to a more purposeful approach of using devices that we can, reuse across multiple different trials within the same therapeutic area, right? So that's the concept. But behind the concept, there are a lot of these processes that needs to happen, right? It can't just be, hey, I want to do this, so I just do this, right? Now, what we are seeing, there are two aspects. I'll speak about it from a patient front as well as from the pharma sponsor front, right? From a patient front, more and more companies are now trying to, as part of the trial, really talk to patients and understand, hey, if I give you an Apple Watch to wear for the study 24/7, 365 for a year-long trial, are you even comfortable wearing that, right?
Mhm.
Are you going to use that? Or are you just going to, sign up and then drop off because it's a hassle for you to maintain two watches, one personal and one study device, right? So that's one. So many companies are trying to figure that out, get that in as part of their design process very early on. The second thing where we are seeing is around all about the data, right? Of course, there's a privacy angle to it, but many sponsors are now trying to solve the integration problem, right? What I mean by that is there are already so many clinical systems out there, right? Every company has their CTMS, their IXRS, their EDC instance, right? So how does this new device, right, or the new platform actually fit into that ecosystem? It's still an ongoing process, right? I personally don't know if anybody has completely solved the problem yet, but it is definitely something that needs to be solved for, because the sheer amount of manual processes that exist, even without the devices, right? Even without this concept of decentralization, just gets compounded even more as we start adding in devices, new platforms, new modalities, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it is enormously complex. And I mean, not that clinical trials were ever not complex, but it just adds that much more complexity to it. So actually, it might be a good chance to launch the second poll, Daniel, if you could, which is really looking at the challenges. What are the biggest challenges that life sciences companies face when using wearable sensors in clinical trials? And you can think of it in terms of wearable sensors. You can think of it as sensor-based devices in general. And you can pick multiple, but don't pick them all, please. That would be copping out. But you have choosing the best fit for purpose technology, data security and privacy, data integration. We kind of touched on that. Usability and human factors, acceptance by participants, which is so critical, and that's what Arnab just spoke to a little bit. Regulatory acceptance, cost is not a non-issue by any means, or other. And half of you have voted. And just pick perhaps the top three if that works for you, or the top one if that works for you. I'd love to see what sort of shows up here. Yeah, it's interesting because in looking at this question and sort of seeing what kind of the world has said, it's often been the issues around data security and privacy that have sort of shown up as being the top issues. And voila, it looks like you all, or it looks like, that is showing up as the number one issue here. So data security and privacy, but closely followed by choosing the best fit for purpose technology. And then, data integration, usability, and human factors, which is certainly also part of choosing the best technology, regulatory factors. So let me actually ask a little bit more about sort of what goes into choosing a technology when you have multiple technologies available. If there's only one sensor device out there that is going to deliver for you the endpoint that you want, if it's been validated, if it's something that is fit for purpose for that population, it's a non-issue. If it's affordable and if the company, if it's acceptable, then your choice is made. But how do you make a choice if in a world where, number one, that the technology landscape is changing so quickly, there are new devices that are being offered literally on a weekly basis, and where you may have choices, and you need to know whether or not those the device that you choose is going to be acceptable. It's not going to be just acceptable for 24 hours, but maybe this is a trial that's going to last weeks or months. And it's going to be acceptable not only to the patients, but also to the researchers. And it's also going to meet the data and security privacy issues. It's a big question, but I'll throw it first out to Jinsy. So what is your sense of where do you start?
So you brought up a very good point, the validation aspects, right? There are, at least from my knowledge, and I'm not as well versed as you guys are, but there's very limited availability, as you guys know, because it hasn't been used so much, of validated tools or validated technology. So finding those devices or those sensors is a process in itself, right? To find out where has it been used before, has it been validated, has it been tried and true before you can even try to want to implement something, right? Now we can always go, so in the aspects of the true and tried paper routes or whatever not, right? So as Arnav mentioned, right, talking to those patients, talking to those investigators, like if I wanted to do something, and we've always used a paper diary or something like that. If I wanted to implement something easier that at the touch of a finger, patients can record something, is that acceptable? Is that something that you're willing to do? And if you are, then let me make it easier for you, right? Because clinical trials, everybody knows, is very cumbersome, right? Going to a doctor's office, going to the clinic, getting all these exams and everything done, especially in this COVID time, it gets draining for patients. And patients already have a lot of fears and they would like to do a lot of stuff at home, right? And so what can we do to make it easier for their life is one of those aspects that I consider very much into our trials, right? Like, how can I make it easier? They're already taking time away from their own life to help us out in our clinical trials. So how can I make it easier for you? And try to implement different solutions in those aspects. But again, finding a validated tool for that. So when we use Apple Watch as well as an Apple phone for our trials, right? Now going through that aspect of, okay, which watch do we do? Do we actually use the Apple Watch? Is there another watch that could give us the same aspects? And so going through those different devices and saying, okay, which can be worn in the shower, which can't be, which one needs more battery power? Like how many, times do they need to interrupt their day to, actually plug it in? Can't they use it at nighttime? Like those different things play into the factor of convenience for the patient, right? You have to put yourself in the patient's view and say, okay, if I was a patient doing this, would I actually want to do this? Because I'm not going to adherence aspects because it's too cumbersome. I'd rather just use a paper diary and just fill it out. Or, hey, this is actually making my life easier. It's very easy. Short questions, it really is as easy as you're telling me it's going to be, and you're also going to protect my privacy and my information's not going into the cloud somewhere else, right? So I think all of those things play into a factor when you're thinking about the devices. Like I've looked at different aspects of 6-minute walk tests, right? Like, can you do that at home? Like, can you have the sensors for pulmonary hypertension or for cardiac aspects, right? And so trying to find that validated tool and make it actually easy. Is it an Apple phone? Is Apple, the right place to go? Is it Androids, and then also the aspects of bring your own device, or do we use a provision device, right? And so that also plays into a role because we're making patients, carry 2-3 phones or 2-3 devices or whatever it may be. So I think various factors bring in, but at the center of everything, it's all that patient, right? The convenience factor, because if it's not convenient for them, they're not going to adhere to it and your compliance is going to go out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do we do pre-testing with patients? I mean, do we go ahead and before investing in frankly an expensive trial, do we do a usability human factors test to ensure that this is something that patients can use?
Exactly. I mean, I know for my trial, at least, we didn't just have the vendor do a UAT user, testing aspects. We had colleagues, we had patients come in and, try to do those testing aspects just to make sure that it was easy and it is going to deliver what we're saying it's going to deliver, right? So.
Absolutely. What about Arnav, your experience? I mean, how important is it really to kind of get it right before you go ahead and invest the big bucks?
Oh, very, because I completely agree with what Jinsy just said there. The other part where we do see there's a lot of questions from sponsors is, of course, the verification is where you start. That's the very basic around it, right? Going to the V3 framework and all of that good stuff. But also the two parts, if I think about it, right? One is the digital measure, the endpoint itself, and what am I using to measure the endpoint, right? So sometimes what we see is device manufacturers, right, would publish feasibility studies on capturing a certain measurement, right? But sponsors really want to use the same device and measure something which was not part of the original feasibility study, right? So can I actually use the watch to measure something that's adjacent or that's more derived in nature as part of the endpoint, right? So that definitely leads to this whole idea of doing some feasibility studies before I can actually implement it into my phase 2s or phase 3s, interventional trials. So that's one. The other piece is what's very interesting is around the user acceptance piece as well as the safety piece, right? Going beyond just the data privacy, because I'll tell you a real story around this. In one of the IRB conversations, right, the IRBs actually saw a device as part of the protocol, and they really asked the question, you are planning around streaming data. Is somebody actually monitoring that channel, right? How frequently are you monitoring that channel for safety events, right? And that become a huge question mark because that requires additional resources, right? You can't just wait till, database lock and close out to be monitoring that channel. So how do you ensure that the IRBs and the ethics committees are feeling comfortable around what you're doing with the data as it comes in real time, right? That's another aspect that the industry is starting to focus on more and more with this newer types of streaming data that we get from wearable devices.
Absolutely. And, putting those systems in place that are going to do that are not going to, in some way, poison the validity of the study itself. I mean, those are all really important aspects to this. And I know in the study that you're currently doing with Yale, I mean, how much of setting that up was really required ensuring that the human factors, including just comfort with technology and having all those sort of processes in place were important?
Well, it was a long process, and I mean, I relate to most things that Jinsy and Arna are bringing to the table here. I mean, there are several frameworks that have several criteria to evaluate the right solution for your intended purpose. But even trying to leverage that is a challenge, because there's not one framework out there. The sponsors don't have the in-house expertise to decide, is this the right framework, or is that one a best approach to do it? So for the heart failure case, we ended up building our an amalgamation of frameworks, and also getting in early contact with the clinical teams, just to make sure that first, the product is safe for patients, it's accurate, the results that are inferred or analyzed from the data that is collected are accurate and reproducible. Then really have a clear sense of what is the intended use of this device or sensor or wearable. Do we need to collect all those data points? So really matching and identifying, we are collecting this data point for the purpose of this, or to analyze that. That is very important, even when presenting the case to the RD and writing the protocol. Having this clarity and line of sight is super important. And then both Jinsey and Arnold brought a really good point that I would digest it in one line, that is, is the form factor, I think it was Jinsey that mentioned this, is the form factor and the experience adequate for your target population, right? Really getting to that experience analysis. Would my target population, for instance, for heart failure patients, we're talking about 65 years and plus. So not all the good stuff in heart failure out there applies to this subset of the population. So it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for the different segments of the population. This is crucial, because if no one's used it, you can't collect the data, you can't conclude on that data, you can't make good use of that data, you don't have any clinical impact. And this takes me to one of the biggest questions that we have, is really to ask the question, does the utilization of this solution have meaningful clinical impact, right? Because one thing is, let's assume that patients have the best experience, it's fit for that demographics of the population. But then the clinicians look at that data and they say, oh, look, this is a waste of time for me. It doesn't fit in my current treatment workflow or clinical workflow. I make no good use of this, and it's a waste of time. So I would never help evolve this solution into an alternative to the gold standard I'm using now, and I wouldn't bring it to usual care. So, and when I talk about that roadmap, is to have line of sight and understand, okay, what do we want to do with this product? What are my commercial intent? What is my commercial intent for this product? Do I want to make it an alternative to gold standard? Okay, so if that's the case, what are the data points that I need to compare? What are the comparable data points coming out of this solution that I could compare and contrast with what is currently being used in usual care? So those were the 5 things that we continuously asked, and we involved the clinical team early, because even that you cover all the technical aspects, all the patient experience aspects, if you don't bring the clinical team earlier, and they are the ones that will make the intended use clinically meaningful. So cutting corners there, it will just lead you to deployment of expensive, very basic studies that will have to be repeated and enhanced to then being able to make a case for reimbursement, commercialization, and whatnot. So that has been my experience, and for the last 3 to 4 years.
Thanks, Adriano. We touched a little bit on the whole BYOD, the bring your own device, and actually let's just pull up the last polling question, which is about that. If sensor-derived PROs can be derived from a patient's own device, what should we do? Should we allow patients to use their own device? Should we standardize and only use the provisioned devices? Does it depend on the patient population, or does it depend on on the endpoint that we're trying to measure. So thoughts here. I mean, obviously, we're, we all are walking around, and demographics don't seem to matter that much anymore. We're all walking around with devices in our hands. We all have, many of us have devices that we love on our wrists. And the question is, do we want to invest in those? However, are they really validated for what it is that we want to be measuring? So it's a couple seconds more. So it's like for the looks like the number one answer was depends on the endpoint. So it depends on the endpoint what it is that we're going to do, what we're, whether or not we're be allowing people to use their own device. And I guess that makes sense. If we're talking about now the Apple Watch, which certainly has some clinically validated endpoints around AFib and some other areas, and certainly is delivered step count and a variety of other endpoints. It's hard to pull people away from their own Apple Watch, and does it really even make sense? What do you think, Arnav, about the answers here?
Oh, this is this is one of those big questions out there. Should we do BYOD or should we go in provision devices route, right? I think I agree with the poll results, right? It depends upon what exactly are you trying to measure, because if you think about things like PRO instruments, right, served up on electronic media, the question of equivalency becomes such a huge deal, right? If I'm using an Android phone 6-inch screen versus I'm using an iPhone 4S, right, which is a 4-inch screen, does it mean the same thing? And you have to be able to prove that, right, in terms of equivalency studies, that yes, it means the same thing as per the two devices that I'm concerned, as well as the paper version of it, right? It depends upon what you're trying to measure and how you're trying to measure it. Even then, what we do observe is this idea of, should we just bypass that issue and go direct to device as a service, right? And provide the provision devices, takes away a lot of that risk in verifying and validating those instruments, as well as the equivalency pieces. And it is just, quicker to be able to do this. The other piece that we hear, which is a little, in the grayish area, and I'll be very transparent, is this innate idea or concept that patients would want it, right? Patients would want a new device. Patient would want a new iPhone, for example, right? Which is not really true when we talk to patients, because they say, hey, look, I already have 3 phones, one for my personal, one for my work, one for something else. I don't really want another phone, because now you're asking me to maintain 4 devices. I don't even know which calendar do I look up, right? So some of those questions are, as we're talking to more and more patients, they want to be able to use their own phone. They want to be able to download an app to be able to do this. Where we also see a little bit of friction, I'll keep this short, is the proliferation of the number of apps that you would use in a single study, right? You have an ePro app, you have something else for your schedule of activities, you have something else for your scheduling, right? And scheduling at the next visit, because let's face it, not all studies are going to be sightless, right? You will still have to go into the site for some hybrid procedures. And when I was actually talking to a patient who was like, why can't the clinical trial have an app which is similar to, let's say, my Mayo Clinic app, right? I just log into there and I do everything, all the way from picking up my RXs and ordering my RXs, right? So why can't a clinical trial have an experience like that? And maybe I'll open it up for Jinsi and Adriano to see what you guys think about this issue, right? Because this is going on for quite some time in the industry.
Jinsi, do you want to go?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jinsi.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, right? I guess when it comes to provision versus bring your own device, right? I think where we come up with the aspects is, obviously, I agree with you, Arna. Patients want to do their own devices. They're more comfortable with it if they have it. If they don't have it, then obviously we can provide whatever, so, but they would love to just use their own aspects. I think where maybe industry, or where, at least from our groups, when we were considering it, is the security aspects, right? The firewall aspects of their data. Like, how can I ensure that there is a firewall with whatever you're putting into this app that's going to be sent in the cloud to a database? How can I ensure that's going to be secure and safe? And I can't do that with your device. I can't bring your device to our IT people and make sure all these, different firewalls, nobody's going to hack. Obviously, people can hack into provision phones as well, but that chance, you're able to monitor provisioned devices more than you're able to, monitor another person's personal device. And so I think that's where, technology's, evolving. If we can get into those aspects where, I don't even, it's like a big brother thing. Do you really want somebody monitoring your devices? I don't know if you want that either, just to ensure that you have that security, right? Obviously, with, different hospitals having their own, portals and patient portals, there's an innate aspects of, okay, yes, some of that information can get leaked out and whatever not, right? But as a part of a clinical trial aspects, I think it's a little bit more riskier that, industry may not, at least I know when we were talking about, we didn't want to risk those aspects.
Yeah, and that's a great point, by the way, because there's also the aspect around who's actually using that app, who's
Exactly.
using the PRO,
Yes.
right?
So yeah, somebody asked me that, like, how do you know? And I'm like, no, a kid could pick up an Apple Watch and be like, da, 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 or walking around with it if you're trying to count steps, put it on a dog. I mean, you wouldn't know that even with a provision device, right? Like, so, it is there, but obviously a lot more people can use, if you're using your device, I'm sure many of us who have kids, my kids are on my devices all the time. They don't care if it's a work or personal. They're using it because it has games or whatever they want to see, right? So, so you get a provision phone that doesn't have anything but your app, then nobody wants to use it except for that patient, right? So
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Adriano, I know that you in the trial you're running, I mean, there's a scale, there's a digital scale. I mean, how do we know that, my wife is not getting on the digital scale and it's not me,
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and there's another study that we are just about to start in atrial fibrillation, very similar and comparable to what Apple done with Apple Watch. But I think that the big question here, bring your own device, yes or no? And looking at the response, I totally agree with the audience here, where they say, depending on what you're measuring. Because if we're talking about patient-reported outcomes only that are typed into a device versus stepping on a scale or wearing a connected sensor for the measurement of a clinical biomarker, that's totally different ballgame, right? Currently PROs, which is basically, to put it simply, you can answer to a survey, and it can be within an app, or like we are doing in some cases, it's just via SMS, right? Compliant as SMS exchange. Have you taken your medication? From the 3 options, press 1, 2, or 3, and it's fully compliant. They don't need to download an app. And they just, answer to the daily questions to report on their outcomes. So you don't need to develop, to overload your teams and to develop anything. It's just SMS-based reporting. So that's one thing. But then when it involves, non-patient reported outcomes, right, where you depend on a device to measure a clinical biomarker, so that's totally different ball game. But bring your own device. If it's in the second case non-PRO, I mean, if it's a certified device, if it's a device that has been cleared already for that intended use, like many researchers are doing, where they are bringing the Apple Watch to their clinical trials, and they use it as part of their bundled offering to manage patients of a certain condition, in this case in the cardiovascular space, right, or cardiometabolic. So really different conversation. It really depends.
Yeah. Let's we have about 15 minutes. Let's leave time for Q&A. We actually have two questions from Joy. I don't know, Joy, if you want to come off of mute and ask the question live, but the first one I think is really well, they're both interesting. and please, everyone else, if you want to go ahead and just throw a question into the chat, we can do that. But Joy, the first question you asked was challenges technologically, and I know, of course, with the Apple Watch, if you're not charging it on a 24-hour basis, it goes dead. What happens when suddenly, someone who is in your trial where you're counting on that data, they sort of technologically disappear? What are some of the challenges that, and how do we address that? Jinsy, in your trial, what have you done it?
Yeah, technology is technology, right? Even now, we can always have some kind of issue with technology working or not working. So we do have, before the trials are implemented, we try to have some mitigation plans in place, right? If your watch doesn't want to work or your phone doesn't want to work, you have, tech support, and make sure that, it's like 24/7 or something kind of tech support for patients to reach out to them, or they reach out to the site, and the site can have troubleshoot FAQs and whatever not, right? Sometimes those don't work and the device just doesn't want to work, right? So we've also implemented, for our trial at least, a paper aspects, right? So if your device is not working, okay, great. Use the paper until you can come to the site and we can fix the problem and give you a new provision device, or, so we try to have mitigation plans in place beforehand. Obviously, we can't think of every single thing. I wish I could think of all kinds of issues that could happen and make sure I have an mitigation plan for those. But those are the challenges we've seen, at least like the device hasn't worked, or, patient populations, like different populations have, issues with email, giving you, emails, or they don't want callbacks, right? Like they won't answer an unknown number, right? And so different aspects of those, like how do we get like, an email address to a patient where they don't have to use their own personal email and then still activate, how do we activate the phone and the device at the site to make it sure that the patient doesn't have any issues when they go home, for those kind of different issues, right? If the device doesn't work, here are the numbers, here's who do you call. But if that still doesn't work, use a paper diary. Those different steps you kind of have to really think about. Like if you were a person using any kind of device, right? What would you like in place to help support you if something does go wrong in that aspect? And then compliance is a huge aspect, right? I don't think we'll ever be able to fix compliance. You can always get the most compliant patient on trials, and those are usually the patients that they pick, right? But when it comes to PRO, there's that fatigue, right? Device fatigue. After 3 months, that fatigue sets in, and then it's just like, especially when it's a 365, 24/7 type of thing, how much are they actually going to utilize it, and what can you do to help mitigate that, right? And so that's where we have our sites involved, like, hey, we noticed that you haven't done anything. Can you, we'll do it together, or, just let us know, like if there's something, you just have to hit a simple no. If nothing happened, just hit no, and that you're done. You don't have to worry about it later on. Nobody's going to bother you. And we also have like a call center support, right? Like where we're monitoring, did somebody do something? And if they don't see any activity for that one patient, calling them or text messaging them, asking them, hey, we noticed that you haven't inputted anything. And they obviously have to opt into these kind of services. We don't want to cold call people who don't want people calling them, right? But like, hey, you haven't said anything, do you want us to help you input this data for you today? Or, like, just go into the app and open it, and, we'll stop bothering you. And so we've had it where, they're implemented a few, in the evenings when people are coming back from work or whatever, not downtime, like, hey, we haven't seen anything, make sure you do, we set these reminders, and we have monthly reminders or bi-weekly. Like in the beginning, it was like daily, then bi-weekly, then monthly, to make sure that patients, are kept reminded, hey, you still have this app, you still have this device that you have to, do.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Hey, Adriano, in the trial that you're running, have the patients become best friends with the call center, their call center help desk?
Well, in some cases, but I think we evolved a lot since we started running, decentralized clinical trials and using PRO, wearable devices, apps, sensors, and whatnot. And I think the big learning here is that the real game changer is when we started depending less and less on the patient to understand what was going on from a technical standpoint, from an experience standpoint, and from a treatment adherence or protocol adherence standpoint. So now what we do is, so there's the device, right, that is patient facing, and there's all the backend platform that monitors all aspects of the clinical trial. So all the way from enrollment, e-consent signature, registration in the study, shipping of the device, and then logging into the device, and then we can see the frequency of use on a daily basis. We have set controls within this piece of analytics that if we don't have a response from the device, so there's an alert on our side, and then we follow up with the patient. So we don't let the patient sit on a non-working device for days because they might not figure out that the device is not working properly. And from a compliance standpoint also, so we have the protocol design to have the outcomes measurement in points in time. If the patient misses those check-ins and the reporting of those measurements of those outcomes, then our clinical team, our study coordination team looks at the dashboard. This milestone was missed. It triggers then a workflow to reach out and support the patient. So we are eliminating the dependency on having the patient get out of their way to reach out to us and say, hey, this is not working. I'm not sure that I'm using this properly. So, and that was a game changer for us in terms of the effectiveness of the intervention and you know, having that audit trail of all the things that went wrong. So every study that we do after, we learn from those lessons and we improve the, you know, the centralized clinical trial management platform.
That's great. Arnab, one of the, Joy, who by the way is the only one so far, and not to shame everyone, if please do put in your questions into the chat, but Joy, thank you so much for your questions. Another question, Joy, that you asked, and I think I'll direct this to you, Arnab, is, you know, what's the thinking around risk, around data that's collected through BYOD, and really looking at consenting to data privacy based on sort of the risk that's inherent in what's being collected. What is your thought there?
No, that's a great point, and I'll tell this through another story, right? Real world experience, because I feel that those help. This was more around not a device, but a disease management platform, right? More of a feasibility study that was going on, pretty small scale. And the idea was to get some patients and really test out how does the outcome affected if in one arm of the study the patients use the disease management platform and the others they do not, right? Mm-hmm. The situation there was there was a lot of recruiting challenges, right? It wasn't a complicated protocol, nowhere near an interventional trial, right? So ideally, there shouldn't be the challenges that we see in recruitment and enrollment and consenting that's going on. So we work with the sponsor to kind of figure out what is going on here, right? Because it's a very simple protocol, it shouldn't be a big problem. The power of the trial was pretty small, right? What we did actually find was very insightful along the wording in your informed consent form. Now, that was putting patients off because the way it was structured, right, caused them to have big question marks around what are you going to do with this data? What impact do I see? Because you are telling me I have to input 5 pages worth of information, right, every other day. What am I going to get out of it? And what am I going to go do with that data? And it was a little bit of a, you know, structuring in a way where the privacy concerns were, or the privacy aspect was stated in a very clear fashion, right? Which caused the alarm bells to ring. I don't really get it. And what we also found is that the small number of sites that were actually recruiting, they really didn't understand how to explain that to the patient when they were having the investigator-patient conversation, right? So whenever that topic came up, it was almost like, yeah, it's going to be used, but there are going to be safeguards around it, and so on and so forth. But nobody really understood how to get that done, right? So the consent process, right? We think that patients always care about how easy it is to use, which they definitely do. But sometimes when your informed consent language is also structured in a way that's not very clear what you're going to do with that data, patients are really, really aware nowadays around what are you trying to do with the information that they're giving you, right?
Mhm.
Did that help in with the real world example? Joy, feel free to go off mute and ask any questions if you want to.
Yeah, that is helpful. Thank you. And thanks everyone for answering my question. I think part of that came up when Jinsey was talking about, sort of the risks between BYOD and a provision device and thinking about the security and data transfer and things like that. And I'm thinking we're all on tech in our personal lives. And I relate to the story you shared where when we really read what they're saying for some of these apps and services they're going to do with our data, it can raise some red flags. But in terms of that risk for BYOD versus the provision device, is there any thought around sort of including that in what they're consenting to? If you're using your own device, we don't have as much ability to protect the security of that data transfer.
It's interesting. So really to let people know what is at risk if they use their own device versus a provision device, and allow them to consent based on that differential in risk. Am I getting it correct?
Yep, you nailed that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, I get, even just sort of stepping back from that interesting question, do patients really know what they're consenting to? Do patients really know what they're consenting to when they sign any consent form? Are we presenting information in such a way that, that they're not just eyes glazing over, that they know what are the important things that they're consenting to? My sense is no. And my sense is that there's a real opportunity around that. There's an opportunity to, frankly, be fairer when it comes to clinical trials, and these are clinical trials in general, when it comes to letting patients know, what it is that, what is happening in this clinical trial. Thoughts is, I think we have 1 minute left. I mean, maybe thumbs very quickly, 30 seconds each person. Arnab, what do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean the question is very fascinating, because what you're essentially asking is, are we moving the decision point on the design over to patients, right? Because what we see around the BYOD versus provision devices decision happens upstream, right? Before it even goes to the patient to be able to say, you have two options. You can go BYOD, we can't guarantee your data privacy, or you can choose to go with our devices and we can guarantee privacy there, right? And one of the bottlenecks there is when the protocol goes up for approval with IRBs, that is when they're going to ask that question, right? How are you going to do that? So we have to solve that problem first. And to Todd's point, make sure that we have a good answer to the question around, if you're moving the decision to the patient, do they really understand what it means to be able to consent to that BYOD approach? That's my 30 seconds.
Good. I think we are actually out of time. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you especially to Jinsey, Adriano, and Arnab for making this a fascinating hour. I mean, obviously we could be doing this for 2 hours. And thanks to everyone in the audience for sticking with us, asking some really good questions. There's at least 1 or 2 questions that did not get answered, and we will go ahead and offline try and send you some responses there. Thanks all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
And, have a great rest of your day.